Dark Souls is a game notorious for its challenging gameplay and its history of changing lives. Countless video essays and articles have been made talking about the philosophy of the game and director Miyazaki's unique storytelling. But more notably, there are countless stories by gamers about how Dark Souls saved them, or academic papers on how the game builds resilience. I was a person who gave up easily, who struggled to adapt to challenge and often resorted to avoidance. My studies suffered, my own mental health in decline, and my self-concept fixed at an all-time low. I believed I was incapable of doing anything I found remotely difficult, and so I struggled to progress with most things in my life. My degree, my passions and hobbies, and my emotional development. I had put off playing Dark Souls for a long time for the same reasons. I knew it would be difficult, and I didn't want to deal with that. But I was so excited to experience the narrative and to be able to say that I had overcome the challenge. So I made it my summer project, before my final year at university, after a long struggle to complete my third. I love learning and education theory. I myself have been trying to foster an incremental theory of self for a long time. I rationalised as much as possible. I knew that ability is not fixed and that you must endure failure to learn, but at the first sign of struggle, I always caved. Now, having played Dark Souls 3 times, that has changed. And I want to explore why Dark Souls is actually more a teacher than a game, and how it teaches us to fail, persist, and to learn.
Where they are locked away to await the end of the world. This is your fate.
In education, according to Dweck, there are two opposing theories of self-experience by learners: the fixed theory of self and the incremental theory of self. The fixed self is characterised by the ideas that ability is fixed and challenge means a complete lack of ability.
But there's no salvation here. You'd have done better to rot in the undead asylum.
Then on the other hand, the incremental theory of self is associated with the idea that ability is malleable and failure is not a threat. The latter is parallel to the mastery or growth mindset.
Ah, hello. You don't look hollow, far from it.
These can determine a learner's goals and subsequent motivation. These concepts of self are formed by automatic thinking patterns developed throughout one's lifetime and informed by one's core beliefs. It takes a great deal of conscious, repetitive self-regulation, particularly inhibition, to address and mitigate these thinking patterns and form new ones. The very beginning of Dark Souls sets out to demonstrate that through failure, persistence, and adapting your approach, you can overcome great challenges and your level of ability can change. Here we begin to see how self-regulation is necessary for the game, particularly if you already struggle with this idea. You start with almost nothing, low level and basic equipment. Upon entering the first boss of the game, the Asylum Demon, the game expects you to do one of two things: die, or run to the door on the left. You're not expected to take that huge health bar on yet. You are expected to fail. Once you get through that door and you progress through the level, you find your way to a ledge, which grants you an advantage over the demon. Here you can drop down and take a good chunk of his health off, before facing him again. This time with more experience. And you can die, and die again, until you figure out how to beat him. This sets the tone for the rest of the game. The classroom environment that learning occurs in is often teeming with high-stakes assessments. Introducing failure as a means of progression rather than assessment into these environments may be a productive, albeit difficult to implement, change and deserves more attention. As this quote states, classroom learning is usually primarily concerned with summative assessments and gives no space to failure in learning. Failure is seen as undesirable and becomes stigmatised. Conversely, video games create an environment where failure is expected or even celebrated. Video games are set apart from other forms of entertainment by their interactability, and more notably, the possibility for failure. Specifically, failure with no consequence and no judgment. This is especially true for Dark Souls, which is notorious for its difficulty, and which also incorporates failure into the game's mechanics and narrative. Bonfires are the game's checkpoints, which can be found spread throughout a level and are never as close to the boss as you want them to be. When you die, you respawn at the last bonfire you rested at, having left all your souls, the in-game currency used for levelling up and upgrading equipment, at the last place you died. The game expects you to go through the level again, this time having learned from your last mistakes, so that you can regain your souls and move forward through the level. If you fail again, you lose the souls for good. However, this doesn't necessarily mean the game only wants you to fail once. To be able to level up to a reasonable level for the endgame, you have to repeat levels multiple times. So long as you learn from your last death and regain the souls, you are rewarded more for repeating a level than making your way past with ease. The only tutorials given appear at the very beginning of the game, explaining the key mechanics. Past that, we are expected to make our way through the game by reflecting on our failures, experimenting with new approaches and moving forward little by little. Each level is designed with opportunities for strategy and one-on-one combat. New problems and challenges are introduced to each level, and as you move through an area, the challenge of that problem increases or is coupled with other elements. These challenges help us develop knowledge and skills that we will need either for the coming boss or later in the game. This game design calls to mind a few pedagogies. First, the incremental addition of challenge relates to flow and motivation theory and the competence model. Flow is characterised by heightened focus and pleasure in learning. It is said to occur when the level of challenge matches the level of ability. This is seen where we are given a basic challenge that builds throughout a level or area. The repetition and escalating difficulty also support self-regulation. This kind of pattern is actually found in training interventions targeting SRL skills. Second, the incorporation of failure into learning in this way can be linked to intelligent fast failure and impasse-driven learning. The game introduces a new problem and allows us to identify the gaps in our abilities, usually by learning from our mistakes.
Quite a fix indeed.
We go from unconscious incompetent to conscious incompetent. After this, we must decide our strategy and practice until successful, moving to conscious competent. Later in the game, where this skill is called upon, it will be so practiced that we will draw upon it automatically. And at this point, we have become unconsciously competent. Finally, the game, as we have established numerous times, wants you to use your failures as part of your learning and improvement. Intelligent fast failure is a method of learning which has shown that pupils who fail initially not only perform well at a given task, but actually outperform those who did not fail in the first place. IFF requires learners to address gaps in their knowledge by making them reflect, problem solve, strategize, and adapt accordingly. Thus they experience deeper learning. This links to the learning by failing strategy used as a learning loop in the game, where failure serves as a signal that there is a gap between their performance and what the game is intending. Impasse-driven learning theory then states that learning only occurs when an impasse occurs. In the context of video games and Dark Souls, as the learning by failing strategy suggests, without the impasse, players don't have the vital information they need to be able to complete the game. Through its level design, Dark Souls makes it clear that failure is essential for improving performance. So not only do the players learn better, but they become accustomed to utilising failure in their learning and are less phased or upset in the face of failure. Which reminds us of the incremental theory of self discussed earlier, where learners are more inclined to mastery and experience intrinsic motivation. The players who benefited most from the game were not the ones who completed it easily, but the ones who struggled through it. As mentioned before, failure is incorporated into the narrative of Dark Souls, more specifically, persisting through failure. The player character and other NPCs are branded with the dark sign and made undead, fated to be eternally reanimated until the fire is linked and the new age of light begins. This not only works to explain enemy respawns as part of the narrative,
I would hate to harm you after death.
but also serves to remind us of our purpose in the game.
Don't you dare go hollow.
Hollowing isn't just a result of dying over and over again, though that does contribute to the process. But hollowing is really submitting to apathy and giving up, having lost all sense of purpose and direction. We see this evidenced through NPC stories like Sigmar, who resigns his sense of adventure, or Solaire, who decides that he may never find his son.
Why? Why? After all this searching, I still cannot find it.
Even Laurentius, who makes his way to Blighttown, likely unable to find Quelana, gives up and hollows. Our own hollowing can be reversed by using humanity. Quite an on-the-nose metaphor, but it tells us everything we need to know. It's worth noting also that cycles are a core element of the story and the game mechanics, so dying over and over again feels relevant to the story of the game. Integrating failure into the story can make for compelling content intended to turn failure itself into a valuable and rewarding experience. This use of dialogue and narrative, coupled with the fantasy world built around us, works to build an endogenous learning experience. Our own goal and the goal of the game become synonymous: persist through failure. So, we persist through failure, we overcome all that hardship. Then what? Then, we understand that all those who completed the game weren't trolling. Then we just get good. All those skills we accrued through failure, and all that we achieved in this game starts to be rewarded. We begin reaping the benefits and can see and feel the stark difference between how we played at the start of the game and how we play now. The non-linear level design allows for us to go back to areas that once seemed challenging and face enemies that at the time were impossible. And of course, we reach the end of the story. We go from ducking away from a shitty fat demon and getting completely dogged on by scrawny hollows to facing Gwyn, Lord of Cinder. And not only do we defeat this mighty king, but we take his throne and link the fire. Then it starts all over again. Dark Souls isn't just one of the greatest games of all time, but it is arguably one of the greatest teachers. Through its immersive world, its carefully designed levels, and its synchronization of the narrative goal and the player goal, it teaches us that if we keep going in the face of adversity and we learn to embrace failure, we can achieve anything.